Murad. He is from Cambridge, England. He is a lecturer of Islamic Studies at University of Cambridge. Got his education at Cambridge and Al-Azhar universities. He's also the translator of Al-Bayhaqi's 77 Branches of Faith, Imam Ghazali's Remembrance of Death, Disciplining of Soul, and Invocations and Supplications. He's also the editor of Imam Ghazali's series. In addition, he is a trustee and secretary of Muslim Academic Trust, director of the Anglo-Muslim Fellowship for Education in Europe. Now I urge Dr. Abdul Hakim Murad to come to the podium and express himself. Thank you.
Alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. You'll be horrified to learn that the organizers actually asked me to speak for 2.5 hours. I think if I threatened to do that, this room would rapidly empty. What I want to do is at least summarize some of the points that I was trying to make in an article that was posted almost a couple of years ago now on the internet. You can't hear me? On the internet, a couple of years ago, I posted an article under the title Islam of the New Millennium, and I've been asked to say a few words about it, and inshallah there'll be a chance to have a few questions on the subject before we break, as we must, for Asr prayer later on. But before we ask questions, perhaps, if you'll permit me, I'll just try and summarize what I try to say in that article. First, rather obvious point that I make is that the millennium, this great fever that seems to be gripping the world at the moment, is, properly speaking, no concern of ours, because we operate according to a very different and much more significant calendar. Regrettably, however, almost every Muslim state nowadays seems to be planning a celebration of some kind or another. Partly because the Muslim world, by and large, with a few honourable exceptions, uses the Anno Domini calendar. And it was... I remember when I first went to Cairo, about 20 years ago now, I suppose, I was amazed to see on the portico of the Egyptian Museum an inscription commemorating the foundation of the museum, I suppose in the 1870s, by the Khadir Ismail, the Muslim ruler of Egypt at the time. And he uses Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord, referring to Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam. And this precedent seems to have become very widespread, but properly speaking, to us the millennium really makes no difference whatsoever. The year 2000 is in fact going to begin during the present Hijri year, which is of course 1420, a year of no particular significance. So should we be worrying about the millennium at all? Is it a question for Muslims? Perhaps the second reservation, the rather more difficult one to handle, is the one about whether we should be anticipating or second-guessing the future at all. What I want to do for the rest of this talk is to speculate, hopefully not too wildly, about the directions in which Islam may take following the great anniversary, using the millennium as a convenient way of talking about the future that we can anticipate as an ummah. Nonetheless, as Sunni Muslims, we do have a theological question that needs to be answered here. Can we actually do this in a halal way? Is it permissible to talk about the future at all? After all, Allah is Alamul Ghuyub, He is the all-knower of the unseen. The future is an open book only to the Al-Qadir Al-Alim, the omniscient determiner of events. And it may well be even that although the year 2000 seems to be just around the corner, the world itself may draw to a close even before then, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is perfectly capable of stopping all of the clocks before then. It may even be that our species itself, as a kind of ironic manifestation of the divine justice, may be an instrument in this. One recalls, for instance, President Kennedy's real hesitations when he heard the advice of his head of the strategic bombing force to go ahead and launch a preemptive massive nuclear strike against the Russians at the time of the Cuban crisis, and he decided on balance against this. But there have been occasions in recent history when it did look as if perhaps the world wouldn't make it to the year 2000. But as Muslims, we know, taking our cue from the hadith of Jibril alayhi salam, that even the Rasul alayhi salatu salam didn't know when the end of time would come. He said, the one questioned knows no more of it than the questioner. Nonetheless, you don't have to read much in the Quran to realize that we are an eschatological community. We are concerned with the end time. Islam is to be the religion of the end time. And as the Quran puts it, the very heavens are pregnant with it. That is the imminent conclusion. And partly triggered by this Quranic warning, millennial expectations have not been particularly unusual in Islamic history. When the first Islamic millennium came around, the year 1000 of the Hijri calendar, there was a good deal of apocalyptic expectation in the air in a number of Muslim countries. So much so that Imam al-Suyuti, who lived in Egypt at that time, actually felt obliged to study the issue and to find out if there was any indication in the hadith as to whether that millennium should be significant. And he wrote a little book called Al-Kashf an Mujawazat Hadhihi al-Ummati al-Alf, which means something like a proof or a disclosure that this ummah will survive the millennium. And he concludes that in fact, on the basis of the enormous body of hadith known to him, that there is no evidence to suggest that the ummah will end at the first millennium of Islam. But it's interesting to reflect, and rather soberingly I think, for our purposes, that writing 500 years ago, 400 years ago, he said that the great signs which will usher in the Day of Judgment will appear in the 15th Islamic century. That's his conclusion on the basis of the hadith that he accessed. But of course all of these conjurings with necessarily very elliptical hadiths were coloured by the Imam's awareness that only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows the future and only prophets are able to prophesy. However, it doesn't mean that we cannot extrapolate or speculate about the possible futures of the Ummah. Why is it useful to reflect on present trends and to think about where they might be leading us? Well, because I think in the first instance, whatever else we might disagree about, just about every Muslim nowadays acknowledges that the Ummah's response to modernity has often been a pretty feeble, unsuccessful one. Faced with the triumph of the West, we have generally not been able to calculate which changes are inevitable and which ones simply have to be resisted. Not a new choice, of course, although for our generation the choice is more sharp, I think, than it's ever been before, because the gulf is widening constantly between any religious perspective on the world and world history and the modern consensual secular Western view. But for instance, in the 18th and the early 19th century, we find the Ottoman Empire, the Khilafah, losing a series of disastrous wars against the Russians. And the main reason was that the Russians were, since the reforms of Peter the Great, militarily and technologically streets ahead of the Muslim armies. Large sections of the ulama and the very traditional Janissary corps, the Yeniçeriler, the backbone of the Ottoman army at that time, resisted any attempts to introduce technology or European methods of organization into the armed forces. That simply wasn't how a jihad should be fought, they were convinced. Their view was that fighting is a man-to-man exercise, and it requires a process of inner spiritual warfare so that one can acquire the virtue known as futuwa, or chivalric, heroic warriorhood. And to those people it really seemed completely un-Islamic that one could shoot somebody with a bullet. To shoot somebody from a distance seemed like a terribly unchivalric, cowardly kind of thing to do. And for this reason, and for various others, the Ottoman army continued to sustain loss after loss at the hands of its better equipped Christian enemies. Another controversy was the argument over printing. Printing came pretty late to the Islamic world. We picked up paper long before the Europeans did from the Chinese, but we didn't pick up the habit of printing from the Chinese. Partly because many of the ulama, in many periods a majority of the ulama, simply believed that printing books was haram. The view was that a text, particularly one dealing with a holy subject such as religion, was something spiritual, almost a sacred phenomenon, and hence couldn't be created in any other way than the traditional loving way through calligraphy, bookbinding, engraving, gilding, and the arts that were cultivated as forms of religious sacred art by the guilds. Also, the ulama thought that a ready availability of Islamic literature was going to cheapen Islamic learning and make students lazy about memorizing texts. It was also thought by some ulama that the process of physically stamping, printing pages was actually disrespectful to books, particularly the Quran. And it actually took a Hungarian convert to Islam, a very interesting individual called Ibrahim Mutafarriqa, to change all of this. And in the 1720s he opens Islam's first printing press with the permission of the Khalifa in Istanbul. Mutafarriqa was a very sincere person. He wasn't a kind of crypto-secularizing subversive. He left us with a short spiritual autobiography, which he calls Risale Islamiyya, which describes how he came to Islam, having been of a Hungarian Christian background, and actually converting to Islam after, some years after the Ottomans had left Hungary. But also, partly because of his ability as a convert to bridge two worlds, he was very aware of the technological backwardness of the Ottoman Empire and of its administrative backwardness. And he printed a book, one of the first books ever printed by a Muslim, which was called Nizam al-Hakam. He printed this in 1733. And in this manifesto, that really is what it is, a manifesto for reform among Muslims, he sets before the traditional Muslim elite, the Khalifa, his courtiers, the court elite, the ulama, the scribal classes, military leadership, the various technological and military reforms that have been taking place elsewhere in Europe. And he warns the Muslim elite that unless Muslims borrow not just from Europe's military technology, but also from its styles of administration and scientific research, then there are going to be no independent Muslim states. Slowly these warnings were heeded by an inherently very conservative Islamic world, and the Ottoman state slowly started the painful process of modernizing itself, attempting all along to preserve what was seen as essential to a core Islamic identity. And that began really the very difficult process of accommodation that we as Muslims living in the West have to face every moment of our lives today, and which is really at the core of all of our relevant Muslim agendas. And really the Hungarian story reminds us that unless we Muslims are conscious of the wider global trends of the age, and unless somehow we come to an understanding with its technologies and its instruments, we will continue to be losers. A severe form of conservatism brings spiritual advantages, to be sure, but these are soon outweighed by the spiritual collapse which is produced by the experience of defeat and marginality. Nothing is worse for a religion's sense of spiritual coherence than the sense of defeat. Nowadays, Muslims in the core Islamic countries often seem to betray the same kind of attitude, because very often we have an endless fascination with short-term political issues. Most of the Islamic movements active now are really involved with short-term issues, and there is a general backdrop of very severe ignorance of the larger tendencies, the big global historic sea changes that are taking place, of which those short-term phenomena are simply the passing manifestations. So typically our state is, as Islamic activists, that we treat the symptoms rather than the underlying disease. And this ignorance can sometimes, in my experience, be quite astonishing and quite terrifying. We have to ask how many leaders of enormous Islamic movements in the world today, sometimes numbering millions of followers, are really acquainted with the ideas that underpin modernity and drive the modern world. Do they really know where they are in history? How many of them can even name the principal intellectual systems of our time? Structuralism, post-structuralism, analytic philosophy, critical theory, postmodernism, and all the rest. Many of them, admittedly, very specious philosophical systems, all of these are simply closed book to them. Very often they've never even heard of them. Instead, they endlessly burble on about the international Zionist Masonic conspiracy, or the new Crusader invasion, or similar phantasms. So if we want to understand why so many of these huge Islamic movements simply fail, perhaps we should begin by acknowledging, rather painfully, that many, at least, of their leaders simply don't have the intellectual grasp of their context in the modern world, which really is the precondition for successfully overcoming the obstacles to the establishment of a truly Islamic order. A Muslim activist who cannot even name the ideologies of modernity cannot realistically hope to overcome them. A no less lamentable ignorance prevails, I think, in the case of the non-ideological trends of the dying 20th century, and which are likely to become far more important and more immediately relevant to us as the new millennium gets going. Like Ibrahim Mutafarriqa 3 centuries ago, Muslims living in the West have to shoulder the duty of alerting other Muslims to the new global realities which are shaping a world in which traditional forms of discourse will simply have no application whatsoever. The younger generation simply not speaking the same cultural language as their parents. It's simply suicidal to assume that in any context whatsoever we can be insulated from these new global realities. The future of the East is actually a Western future. Easternness, indigenous, autonomous, authentic cultures are everywhere and inexorably giving way to the Western reality. Increasingly, we live in a single world, thanks to a monocultural process which is accelerating all the time, driven by the mass media and even more modern forms of communication and cultural diffusion. So we live in an interlocking world. There is now a mosque in the World Bank. Interesting, ironic, strange. And there's also 2 branches of McDonald's in Mecca. In fact, as soon as you come out of the main door, the Bab al-Malik Abdal Aziz now of the Haram extension in Mecca, the first thing you see is not one of the houses of the Sahaba, or one of the mountains, or one of the beautiful traditional things that you would have seen but a few years ago. You see Colonel Sanders right there in front of you as you come out of Islam's holiest place. Well, Muslims from the traditional heartlands may just shrug their shoulders at that, but what is the influence of all of this on the young? What happens to a young Muslim student studying at an American university? Perhaps somebody who's been sent here from a rather traditional corner of the world. He learns about postmodernism and post-structuralism, and that these are ideologies of profound influence in the modern West, and that the West is intellectually driven. The journalists have picked up ideas from their teachers picked up ideas from university professors, and all of them are evincing, in a kind of trickle-down fashion, a particular philosophical worldview, about which generally we don't trouble to learn. So this young student learns that these are enormously profound and influential movements in the modern world, and hence the modern global system of which the Muslim world is absolutely a part. And he asks his local Islamic leaders how to disprove them, and when they cannot, or they never even heard of them, he grows confused, and his confidence in Islam as a timeless truth is badly shaken. And under circumstances such as this, really it's inevitable that increasingly only the less intelligent really remain Muslim. In some cases we can see this. It's a filtering process that's already very evident in some activist circles. So it's a religious obligation, a farida, particularly upon those of us living in the West and engaging with the West and its cultural forms on a daily basis, to understand what it's about and to understand the globalizing processes that are going to steam ahead around us and despite us, whether we like it or not. Now, obviously, in the time that remains to me, I'm not going to offer an Islamic diagnosis, still yet a solution to all of the multifarious and very bewildering trends that are going on around us. But I do want to look just at a few representative issues. Not because they can be easily resolved, but because I think they serve to suggest the shape of the challenges that are going to face the Ummah in the next few decades. These 3 issues, I want to talk about demography, the population situation, religious change, and the environment. Firstly, the demographic issue. Again, something we don't pay much attention to particularly, but of enormous importance because it's inexorable. It's one of the things that's most predictable. Population trends are easily extrapolated, and they have an enormous effect on the course of civilizations. And unless there's some unimaginable catastrophe, a new plague or some nuclear holocaust, almost certainly we can be pretty confident of where the Ummah will be demographically in 30 or 40 years' time. Let's have a look at the figures that are usually offered. At the beginning of the present century, it's estimated quite reliably that around 12.5% of the world's population was Muslim. This was after the Industrial Revolution, which had resulted in an enormous population explosion, essentially in the Christian world, and before the same phenomenon had begun in the world of Islam. In 1980, that figure had risen to 16.9%, and the figure for the end of the millennium, now basically, is put at around about 21%. So this already is a hugely important change, and from our point of view, in terms of raw statistics, if there is safety in numbers, very encouraging. That we should have increased from 13% of the world's population to over 20% of the world's population in 100 years is pretty interesting. Percentages, incidentally, for other religions, generally static. Interestingly, the percentage for atheism over the past 20 years has gone down quite sharply, largely as a result of the rediscovery of religion in the former socialist countries. So these figures are of considerable significance, and even more interesting are the statistics that we can reasonably forecast if we extrapolate them into the years ahead. Samuel Huntington, who is one of the great scaremongers that this country has regrettably produced, I think really not as an Islamophobic agenda. I don't read him as Islamophobic, but rather as somebody who is more interested in directing an internal cultural argument in the United States about multiculturalism. But in any case, he offers figures, well attested, that suggest that by the year 2025, about a quarter of the world's population will be Muslim. And shortly after, the Muslims will become 30%, and at that time, the Muslims will be in absolute terms the most numerous religious community on the planet. That is, probably within the lifetime of many people here, we will find ourselves members of the world's biggest religion, outnumbering all of the thousands of Christian denominations put together. Let me move on a little bit. This rapid increase in Muslim numbers does, of course, have enormous political entailments. It's not that it's going to have immediate results for organizations such as the United Nations, which are not basically democratic organizations insofar as really significant questions relating to global economics, global security and so forth are taken not by the General Assembly, but by the necessarily Western-dominated Security Council. It's not going to have an immediate effect in that way. But it does have other effects, and perhaps that's one reason why in 1994 the United Nations chose Cairo, the world's most populous Muslim city, as the venue for its population conference. One area of concern is going to be that the new millennium is dawning over a Muslim world that has a population disequilibrium, in as much as there is a massively disproportionate number of young people. And any student of history will tell you that has enormous implications for political life as well. Historically, such contexts have invariably bred turmoil, revolution, instability. One explanation, for instance, for the Protestant Reformation in Europe is that in 16th century Germany, for various reasons, there was a preponderance of young people, the result of new agricultural and political arrangements. Also, the growth of fascism in Central Europe in the 1930s is also attributable in large measure to the growth in numbers of young people. Over the border in Islamic history, we find a conspicuous example, again in the 16th century, in the form of the Jalali rebellions, which really shook Ottoman control of the core Ottoman lands. These were young men who simply didn't find any work and hence turned to various forms of political disaffection. And the Islamic revival over the past few years has faithfully reflected this normal historical pattern. One of the useful things that Samuel Huntington does do in his book is to equate the peaking of Islamic radical activity in various countries with the demographic phenomenon. One of the first Muslim countries to reach a peak proportion of youth in the 1970s was Iran, and of course that was the first place where Islamic activism first really became a mass movement. Revolution took place in 1979. In other countries, the peak was reached rather later. So in Algeria, the proportion was reached in 1989, just when the FIS, the main Islamic party, there was winning its greatest support. So those of us who are concerned with the future of the Ummah and with laying down institutional and intellectual frameworks for handling the problems of the future have to contend with this brute fact, a youth bulge that's likely to continue for some time in a number of Muslim societies. The number of people in their early 20s will continue to increase in Egypt, Morocco, Syria, Tunisia, and quite a few other countries. As compared to 1990, in the year 2010, entrance to the jobs markets will increase by about 50% in most Arab countries. The unemployment problem, already very acute, will become intolerable. And this is demonstrably rendering some states difficult to govern. Hence the familiar phenomenon in many Muslim countries of the bunker regime. And in some places, it's unclear whether these bunker regimes can survive. In most cases, they are surviving, despite, as in places like Algeria, where the present regime was defeated roundly in the elections earlier in this decade, but nonetheless has held on. They can hold on thanks to technology. Before the modern world, mass revolts, peasant revolts if you like, stood a good chance of success because the disparity in technological equipment between the rebellion and the soldiers of the king was not so great. Nowadays that disparity is gigantic, and such mass rebellions in the modern world simply have a record of failing. Military regimes now can survive indefinitely in the face of massive popular discontent. You can control a country in quite a stable, reliable way. Even if everybody hates your guts, you can continue to do that. And this is really one of the first, perhaps it's the first generation in history where that has really been possible. Techniques of surveillance becoming more sophisticated, techniques of interrogation, torture becoming far more effective than they ever were. And they're proving very successful against a wide range of underground movements in so many corners of the Islamic world. Now this really leads to the second of the three issues confronting us in the next few decades that I suggested I would talk about. And this second issue is the issue of religious change and the challenge posed by modernity, globalization, and demographic alienation and confusion to traditional readings of Islam. Societies governed in this way by the various bunker regimes are becoming what might be called pressure cooker societies. And the consequences for the human soul of being exposed to this kind of pressure are quite alarming. The kind of religious life forms that can exist and flourish under those conditions are often very aberrant, strange ones. And already in the Islamic world we are seeing no shortage of signs of extreme, aberrant, strange behavior that earlier generations of believers would have found quite unthinkable. This is of course not without precedent. There have been extremist movements in Islam before, but they have always been roundly defeated, rejected by the caliphs, driven out to the bad lands of southwestern Iran and various other places where they were able to survive for a few centuries. This is the movement known as Kharijism, a movement that existed in early Islam and was really effectively extinguished after the end of the Umayyad period, apart from a few fairly neutralized pockets here and there. But such movements have regrettably again become a central feature of the religious political landscape of the Muslim world, and they're not going away. they're not doing our reputation any good, they're not doing the unity of our communities any good, and they seem to be poised to expand for some years to come, because the demographic and psychic, as it were, conditions for their flourishing are not going to go away. Mainstream Islamic movements, Muslim Brotherhood and so forth, are seen as having simply failed in their objective of achieving power, and desperate young people are turning to more radical alternatives. Kharijism is ironic, and modern Kharijism is ironic in that although it demands a return to unity, it is in practice a disunifying force and itself split into countless different factions. But it has one defining feature, which is the phenomenon known as takfir, declaring other Muslims to be outside the pale of Islam and hence worthy of death. And this tendency was always rejected angrily by the ulama of high classical Islam. Imam al-Ghazali wrote the classic definition of who is and who isn't a Muslim in his book Faisal at-Tafriqa. And he explains that there really is no more difficult and complex and demanding task than declaring formally anybody to be actually outside Islam. As long as they say La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah. The borders in traditional Islam are drawn very wide and very generously. And today, Sunni school children in traditional Arab countries still memorize texts such as the Jawharat al-Tawheed of Imam al-Laqani, who says, إِذْ جَائِزٌ غُفْرَانُ غَيْرِ الْكُفْرِ فَلَا نُكَفِّرْ مُؤْمِنًا بِالْوِزْرِ. Since forgiving what is not unbelief is possible, as we do not declare an unbeliever any believer on account of a sin. وَمَنْ يَمُتْ وَلَمْ يَتُبْ مِنْ ذَنْبِهِ فَأَمْرُهُ مُفَوَّضٌ لِرَبِّهِ. Whoever dies and has not repented of his sin, his matter is turned over to his Lord. In other words, refer it to a higher court. Don't try and pass judgment yourself. And the legitimation of differences of understanding in fiqh was rooted in differing understandings of ijtihad. And differences in spiritualities were understood and accommodated in a particularly generous way by the people of Tasawwuf, in terms of the idea of at-turuq ila Allah bi'adadi anfas al-khalaiq. The roads to Allah are as numerous as the breaths drawn by creatures. As one of the great Sufi poets put it, عباراتنا شتى وحسنك واحد وكل إلى ذاك الجمال يشير. This is from the Al-Mabahith al-Asliya of Ibn al-Banna. Our expressions differ. The way we describe Allah is different, but your beauty is one, and all are pointing towards that same beauty. Diversity really has always been a characteristic of Islamic cultures and one of the great strengths of Islamic civilization, in contrast to many medieval Christian cultures that were always striving to suppress religious diversity. However, there is a growing tendency visible amongst many young Muslims today in the West and elsewhere in favor of effectively totalitarian forms of Islam. The young activist cries, everyone who disagrees with me is a sinner, is a kafir, and is going to hell. This mentality clearly is a recrudescence of an essentially Khariji idea of takfir. But to understand why it's growing in the modern ummah and why it's doing so much harm to our efforts to establish Islam here in the West, we really have to understand not just the formal history but also the, as it were, psycho-history of our situation. Because religious movements are the expression of not just doctrines and scriptures, but also, and sometimes preeminently, of the various insecurities and the hopes and fears of individual humans and human collectivities. The text is the same, whoever reads it, but the eyes with which the text is read are necessarily different, and the interpretation of the religion will differ accordingly. In times of confidence, Muslim theologies tend to be broad, irenic, inclusive, generous. But when the community of the mu'minun feels itself under threat, exclusivism is the frequent result, like the hedgehog that curls up into a ball and becomes prickly, difficult to approach. And really never has the Ummah felt more fundamentally threatened than it has today. Even in the times of the Crusades and the Mongol invasions, other various calamities that have befallen the Islamic world in its long history, people never felt quite as terrified and as disoriented as we do today. In America and in the Muslim ghettos of Europe, the takfir phenomenon is gaining ground steadily. There are factions in the inner cities who are quite confident that they're the only ones going to Jannah, and that 99% of people who think they're Muslims are in fact not Muslims at all. It's a really distasteful insult, I would say, to the divine moral coherence, to say that the entire cosmos has been created by one who describes himself as Rahman and Rahim, and in fact such a tiny fragment of humanity has got things right. Strange how people can believe that such a world could have been created. Of course, this psychic state exists universally. It's not just a Muslim problem. It exists not just in Islam, it exists in Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism. It existed last week in Skokie, when somebody from an ostensibly Christian movement, at least it calls itself Christian, opened fire on passers-by. There's a conspicuous tendency in the marginalized youth of of all religious communities towards a kind of exclusivism. In Islamic manifestations, it's reasonable to suppose that this tendency is going to grow, as I said, in relative significance as we traverse the end of the century. One aspect of it that is post-traditional is that it's not millenarial in its rhetoric. Earlier, radical, politically destabilizing movements in the Islamic world tended to arise with the idea that the Mahdi was nigh, or even that their leader was the Mahdi. It's a sign of decadence, if you like, that we don't talk in those terms any longer. We've become perhaps rather secularized. This movement is going to stay with us. It will continue to drag the name of our religion through the mud by slitting the throats of tourists and detonating minor targets in pinprick attacks on Western interests, attacks that, of course, do the cause of Islam immeasurable harm. As well as dividing the Islamic movement, dividing our communities, introducing bitterness and suspicion into our communities, it's going to provide the regimes with an excuse further to suppress religion generally and to marginalize it, and hence to drive even more of this lost generation of young activists into the arms of forms of extremism. Now, this threat of neo-Khariji heresy is thus a real one. It's already with us. We cannot treat it as a movement of a few aberrants on the fringes. It is starting to move into communities more generally, and it's important that Muslim communities, ethnic groups, mosques and so forth do hold regular events to analyze these movements, who is supporting them, what their beliefs are, and to try and liaise and present, first of all, the real face of Islam to the ambient culture and media, and also to try and out-argue them by training indigenous, traditional Sunni ulama who can simply defeat them using the scriptural arguments. There is no other way, really, of defeating them. That's the only logic that they will understand. But I want now to move on to the third of my three themes, and one that perhaps is even more apocalyptic, as it were, than the other two. And this is the theme of the environment, something that we Muslims hardly ever seem to talk about. And this is really very peculiar because the Quran itself is an environmentally sensitive document. It's a religious text that endlessly conjures with the signs of the natural world as evidences for the goodness and beauty and providence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Generally, we don't seem to pay much attention to that aspect of the book. But certainly it should frame our response to the environmental crisis, which is not going away and is becoming more and more urgent, so much so that certainly the Western world is taking it with deadly seriousness. There's a whole cluster of questions here, obviously. Clearly, as we leave the present century, our planet is in disastrous shape. Compared to 100 years ago, and certainly in catastrophic shape compared to, say, the year 1000. And the fault lies with materialism, greed, enabled particularly by Enlightenment fantasies of noble human beings transcending the fetters of nature, presiding over the physical order, and also of a certain type of Protestant capitalist ethic, which has really presided over what we might describe as the gang rape of Mother Earth. The planet is in very bad shape. Everywhere the face of the planet is scarred. Megatons of toxic waste are now swimming about in our oceans or hovering in the stratosphere. Every day, another 12 named species becomes extinct. Biologists once told me that probably there's about 100 species that become extinct every day that we don't know about. And I asked him, well, how do you know? He said that was a rather interesting question. But the scale of the catastrophe is certainly greater than that scientists are able to measure. Every form of life, apart from our own and certain domestic animals, is facing a kind of holocaust, decimated by the massacres of modernity. In England, we're still worrying about the BSE disaster. UK government analysts called in by politicians to quell public fears about the outbreak of the Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which is this terrible, debilitating illness that affects people who've been eating this beef produced from cows who have been fed on animal offal, thus violating the natural order. They reckon that maybe 30,000 British people have already been contaminated with this disease, but they don't really know. One of the most alarming features of the present breakdown in the traditional natural order of the cosmos is that we really, because this has never happened before, have no idea of its true extent or its true implications. The natural order is so finely balanced. As always, progress is a monumental gamble. But the most urgent crisis that we face as we move into the new and, in many ways, ominous millennium is the issue of global warming. Global warming, and again we don't know quite how much is up there, but certainly for 100 years we've been pumping greenhouse gases into the skies, and we're now beginning to realize that the bill for this activity has to be paid. Now, Muslims have to focus on this issue really more than almost anybody else, because it's going to affect Islamic countries far more radically than the West. But disturbingly, very few people in the Islamic world really seem to have grappled with the question. In England now, global warming is noted even by the ordinary citizen. Temperature records where I live go back 300 years, but the 10 hottest years have all occurred since 1945. And 4 of the 5 hottest have been in the past decade. Rainfall, no less erratic, so that 1997 experienced the driest January for 200 years. Ocean storms have become so violent that the North Sea oil industry is now forced to lay pipelines under the sea rather than use tankers, because the seas are simply too rough now. The exact figures, surprisingly enough, do seem to be tiny. It's estimated that the rise in average world temperature between 1990 and 2050 will be a mere 1.5 degrees centigrade. But the rise in temperature, which 4 millennia ago ended the last ice age, was only half a degree more than this. Research has shown that the polar ice caps are already starting to melt, which is why the sea level is now creeping up by 5 millimeters a year. Places like the North Norfolk coast, the European Union is spending billions of pounds on new concrete defences to keep the sea at bay. But clearly the natural disorder that has been unleashed through the breakdown of a traditional, natural, balanced approach to the environment cannot be withstood by the puny means available to human beings. Now, for the West, this is bad news, but there's also perhaps some good news involved, particularly in cold little northern islands like England. We're quite happy with the idea that one day we'll be able to grow mangoes and oranges and actually enjoy our beaches, which at the moment we can't. One reason why at the Rio summit, 7 years ago now, most Western countries really showed themselves not terribly interested in the issue. But sadly, the Muslim world was the part of the world that campaigned most strongly against environmental controls. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Brunei, Kazakhstan, and a number of others, because their economies are largely dependent on oil and gas. And if you switch energy production in Western countries from oil and gas generating to alternative forms of energy, tidal power, hydroelectricity, whatever, those countries would lose out immediately. So we have a pretty decrepit record on this. And partly because of this kind of blinkered short-termism, Muslim circles still seem only feebly conscious of the great climatic catastrophe that the next millennium may well portend. But just consider some of the precursors of the catastrophe that have already befallen Muslim communities. In the Sahel countries of Africa, such as Chad, Mali and Niger, which have 80 to 90% Muslim populations, rainfall is declining by 10% every decade. The Sahara's great ocean of sand is becoming even larger. The conquering sand dunes inexorably marching over the little small holdings of marginal farmers and pastoralists in its southern fringes. The climate's worsening in other ways too. The Sudan in the late 1980s was devastated by a disastrous drought. That was ended by the worst floods in living memory. And if you look at any climatic map, you'll see that agriculture in the great majority of Muslim countries is a pretty marginal business. In Algeria, it's calculated that a further 15% decline in rainfall will eliminate most of the remaining farmland, sending further waves of migrants into the cities, exacerbating the religious and political problems that I already mentioned. Similar situation over the border in Morocco, where the worst drought in living memory ended only in 1995. The Yemen is now suffering very badly because of decline in the traditional monsoon patterns in the Indian Ocean, another consequence of global warming. In Bangladesh, the problem is not a shortage of water, but a great superabundance of water. Floods are now normal every 3 or 4 years, not because of the global monsoon pattern being disturbed, but because of large-scale deforestation in the Himalayas, which reduces the soil's capacity to retain water. And a friend of mine in London is doing his doctorate in engineering at Imperial College, and his study is commissioned by a Bangladeshi government organization which has a budget of $3 billion. Remember, this is Bangladesh, with the sole object of constructing enormous earth berms or walls around the major cities of Bangladesh, which it's expected over the coming years are going to become islands on a semi-permanent basis. So, calamities not just forecast but already underway, and the Muslim world really is in the front line of many of them. Anyway, those are the 3 issues that I wanted to at least raise for your consideration. Perhaps at least some of the questions will address them. Is there cause for optimism or is there cause for alarm? Well, we know that the Rasul alayhi salatu wasalam kana yuhibbul fa'l. He used to like auspiciousness, optimism, good omens. And we also knew that he taught tawakkul, reliance on the providence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But he also taught that reliance on Allah entails tying up one's camel first. So what are the camels that we Muslims should be thinking about tying up over the next few decades? Now, I'll mention only one issue here, and that has to be the creation and cultivation of an informed leadership. Religious communities cannot thrive, and certainly cannot overcome the issues of the gravity of those that now confront us unless they have an informed leadership. It simply is not enough to parachute people in from different parts of the Muslim world to lead little communities in England, for instance, if they hardly speak the language of the people they're serving, the younger generation. That's simply a recipe for disaster. The first priority of Muslim communities everywhere, and particularly in the West, has to be the establishment of institutions for the training of indigenous ulama. And I don't mean people who are simple carbon copies of the output of traditional madaris in the Islamic world. I mean something a good deal more risky and a good deal more adventurous. I mean people who are taught overwhelmingly in English, but with a good knowledge of Arabic. People who are aware of the traditional curriculum and have memorized a few of the traditional texts, but people who are also profoundly aware of the nature of the modern world and of the nature of the problems faced by young people, who are themselves young people and able to deal with the problems of the new generation, problems that the older generation quite frequently simply cannot hear. And that problem really should not be beyond us. There are resources available in the West to Muslims. There is the political and cultural freedom available to us. And there is also the financial reserves available. Many members of our communities, alhamdulillah, are wealthy to create such institutions. Hamza Yusuf's Zaytuna Institute, I think, is an important indication of what can be achieved. But we need a lot more. And although we Muslims in the West are sometimes pessimistic about our own chances for large-scale cultural survival as the generations roll by, I think there is also room for an optimism about our larger role in bringing around the Islamic Ummah from its present confused, lamentable, poorly led state, because here we have the opportunity to train people who really are culturally up to the job of challenging the threats that lie ahead in the next few years. Alhamdulillah, that's really a summary of the thing that I put on the internet, and those of you who want can look it up and criticize it, as many have already done so, and my email service reminds me just about every morning. But I think there's a chance, inshallah, for a few questions, and inshallah we'll be hearing also from Shaykh Ma'asum Naqshbandi. Wassalamu alaikum.